participation in electoral processes is actually below 25%. And in Chile, at the local level, at the country where I'm from, it's only to 10%, and only 2% of women elected are representative of indigenous people. This situation represents an increasing threat to democracy, as we know, because as different studies show, and our panelists will share with us today, more women representation in politics means more stability, equality, and social welfare for the societies they lead, because women tend to prioritize health, education, and development, and their participation boosts citizens' confidence in democracy. Next, please. 2 years in the pandemic, a study by economists from the University of Barcelona and the University of Sao Paulo of around 700 Brazilian municipalities found that those with female mayors had an average at least 37% fewer COVID-19 deaths per capita than those with male mayors. And even considering the lack of studies on the role of women as policymakers in times of crisis, studies from India, Italy, and China have found that corruption is less intense among female leaders. We're taking here about facts that clearly show the positive impact women participation can have, and it has, on democracy. So then why do we still have a long way to go to achieve parity in decision-making processes? That's kind of the overarching question. Women, unlike their male counterparts, face barriers designed to keep them out of public life by questioning not only their capacity to hold a public office individually, but most important, by putting in doubt the qualities of women to be active citizens in democracy. Today, we see highly coordinated cross-border movements led by big groups of interest against women that promote narratives to put women as unfit to participate in public life in different platforms. One of these barriers is violence against women in political life, defined as any action, conduct, or omission that, based on gender, has the effect of purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women of their political rights. This type of violence includes, but it's not limited to, physical, sexual, psychological, moral, economic, or symbolic violence. In the Latin American region, for example, the Ciudadanos Todas Mexican Observatory reported that last electoral process in Mexico was the most violent for women, with 21 candidates murdered by May of this year. And according to Mexico Pueblo, another one of our partners, the number of women candidates murdered during the election was actually 60. The atrocious murders of women candidates began as online gender-based attacks carried out by anonymous actors that pursued the main objective of delegitimizing women's participation in public life. So how many more lives are to be taken as online political gender violence? The Observatory Ciudadanas Todas also exposed that most women candidates were victims of political gender violence, with 80% of the cases being at the municipal level. Physical violence may be the most evident, but we consider that in recent years, these attacks begin behind the screen as online political gender-based violence. One of this type of violence is disinformation, as I mentioned before, or we're seeing highly coordinated disinformation campaigns against women who hold particularly key positions in democratic institutions, as it is happening with women members of the Constitutional Convention, in Chile. Elisa Loncón, president of the convention, has been the target of malicious attacks that seek to undermine her role as a strong and empowered public figure. Most of the attacks are based on her being a part of the Mapuche people, indigenous community, and women. This being a clear example of the intersection of vulnerabilities. The first step to fight this threat to democracy is recognizing gender disinformation as a public problem that affects all citizens. This must be done in different scenarios, particularly the ones that gather key stakeholders of our societies, as it is the platform that we have at Summit of Democracy. So With this, thank you again for being here, and let me introduce with very much humble and a lot of honor, the 4 female leaders that we have here today. Lilian Risik is currently the president and founder of South Sudan's Women Empowerment Network, which advocates for women's rights and inclusion in all decision-making levels. Lilian is involved in several initiatives, including mainstreaming gender and peace building, and in strengthening local women peacemakers' capacity in South Sudan, as well as working with various key stakeholders in raising awareness of vital instruments on women's rights. Lilian holds a master's degree in international development from American University in Washington, D.C., and is a postgraduate certificate on gender leadership and public policy from the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Lucina Di Mecco is a gender equality expert and women's rights advocate with expertise in women and girls empowerment, female political participation, and gender disinformation. In 2021, she was named Apolitical's 100 most influential people in gender policy for 2021. And she is the co-founder of She Persister Global, a cross-national feminist initiative to tackle gender disinformation and online attacks against women in politics through education, research, support to women in politics, and platform pushback. And along with co-founder She Persister Christina Wilford, she's supporting our efforts working on combating disinformation against women in public life. Elisa Vigil is a lawyer specializing in commercial and women's law. She's currently a congresswoman of Madrid. She is co-founder of the Lilian Women's NGO, through which they promote training courses, empowerment, business, psychological support, creation of the pioneering project of a shelter for battered women and victims of war, as well as programs of self-employment with microcredits. Furthermore, she is a political activist who presides over the new generation of the Popular Party in the District of Madrid. And Tasreen Hussein is a gender specialist with experience in the areas of women's empowerment, capacity building, civic participation, and women in peace and security programming globally. Tasreen is currently serving as the Director of Leadership and Social Impact at Vital Voices Global Partnership. And in her role, she leads the coordination of Vital Voices 100 program, the Leadership Incubator, the Vital Voices Honorary Program, and provides tailored support for women of the Vital Voices Global Leadership Network. And finally, Betilde Munoz-Bogusian has more than 15 years of experience leading missions, programs, and projects, and conducted research on issues of democracy and elections, equity, and social inclusion, among others. She is currently serving as Director of the Department of Social Inclusion at the Organization of American States. Here, she leads work on the inclusion of populations in vulnerable situations and on the promotion of the full exercise of their human rights. She's also the director of, she also directs work on migration and refugees in support of the OAS, Secretary General and member states. Wow. So we have about 10 minutes and I just wanna head right into our conversation. So I would like to start with Lilian. Lilian, why is crucial to have women represented in public life, and how does women representation strengthen democracy as a whole? You have 10 minutes. You're muted. Yeah, muted again. There it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I am honored to be among these amazing women here today, and I just want to greet everybody from wherever they are. Women, they represent half of the world's population, but yet we have only 21 women as head of states. And we have about 20% parliamentarians, about 10% political parties leadership. So countries like the United States, it took them 144 years to recognize the rights of the women to vote. So this is for us as a victory. Those us who are advocating for women's rights and participation. It's a very significant victory. But the achievement did not come easily. There was so much work went into that, having women to vote in a democratic process. So achieving these milestones required a lengthy and complex struggle. Victory took decades of sustained agitation, protests championed by women's movement all around the world. Since then there are so many steps taken to advance women further into participation. But there are always challenges to women participation. But why do we need women actually to participate? As you mentioned earlier, Paulina, that when women are in power, they focus on issues that really affect the social issues. They affect and think that that issues that affect families. So institutions and civil society organizations around the world, they are all globally now seeking how women can increase women's participation in political processes. So although countries worldwide in Global South have adopted a quota system, but some might question the quota system itself, whether it has been effective or not. Because as we know, this quota system, they would have it in a paper, but they will not adhere to. Not a lot of countries will actually implement it. Countries like South Sudan, they have a quota system that requires women to participate by 30%, but we did not reach that 30%. It's not been implemented. So that is not only in South Sudan, but in many countries that adopted the quota system. So countries like Rwanda, Bolivia, United Arab Emirates, now they are on the top list of women representations in the parliament, particularly in the parliament. But as I was saying earlier, now we have to differentiate between the number and the effectiveness, because Rwanda has a 65% representation of women in parliament, but they're still questioning the effectiveness of that participation. So it's not necessarily a number as such, because some would argue that if you want more women in power, okay, we can bring more women in power, and we say, okay, you want 25%, what is 25% of whatever number? Okay, here is the number. But whether that participation is effective or not, that is another question. So no doubt, and we will all agree with me, that societies prosper and grow politically and economically when women are in power. We all agree on that. We know that. I appreciate the presentation of Pauline. She mentioned how women are less corrupt by nature. It doesn't need more argument on that area. We have recently seen the shining example of that. Women who were head of states in countries like Denmark, Finland, Iceland, New Zealand, Germany, and Slovakia, how they have responded to the COVID-19. The countries with the women who are president are the most effective in terms of response to COVID-19, to the pandemic. So this is one example why we need more women in power. But we also have seen a number of women civil society organizations worldwide engaging in petitioning their leaders, including women in decision-making, to address not only gender-related issues, but issues concerning a larger society. Women are mothers, and mothers are caring. So when they are in power, they view the whole population as their children, and they want the best for their children. But the critical question remains, and why we're all here today, is how do we improve on this recognizable achievement of women participation? How do we foster and strengthen democracy? If we are half of the population, so that means 50-50, we have to be represented in that political arena by 50-50 as well. So there are several challenges, and I'm going to mention only 3 challenges that I think, and you might agree with me, that might be the reason that obstacles that in front of women and in preventing women from participation. First, economic disempowerment. So women still lack access to control economic resources to compete equitably in elections in many countries. If there is an election, men have all the resources, the economic, we don't. So we lose because, and people don't even take women seriously. So they don't necessarily donate to their campaign. She's just a woman, that's what they say. Secondly, some existing cultural norms, and each country is depend on their context. But in a context like South Sudan, forced and early marriages. So a lot of young girls, they are forced into these arranged marriages. So they will not be able to really participate because the society will, they assign a role for a woman. Once you are born as a woman, you have a role to play and you can't go out of that. Thirdly, the legal system itself. So the legal system that enforce a patriarchal norms created by men, discriminated against women. Men are the one who really create these laws, and they expect women to be actors in a men-controlled political platforms. So we are actors on this platform, but there are things countries, policymakers, donors can really do to improve women political participation. Number one, countries, they must initiate and engage in institutional reform. So it's not enough just to train women in political office. You can train so many women as you want, but the real change has to come from the institution itself, because these institutions were created on exclusion. So you have to reform the institution in order to be able to absorb more women. So countries need to avoid the women's cosmetic representation and start to view women's effective participation as a significant benchmark of democratic success. Second, the policymakers. So policymakers, they need to adopt policies that empower women economically, and they have to link politics to socioeconomic power to avoid benefiting only the elite. And I know in many countries you have this group of elite that they have more control, they have privilege, they have more control of resources, and we don't, and women don't. So any examination of socioeconomic status between women and men often reveal inequalities in access to resources. And there are issues related to privilege, power, and control, as I mentioned. And lastly, but not least, is the donors. It's compelling to support women's movement and civil society organizations because they are the agent of change. All of us, we're coming from different countries, but we speak one language, that we call for democracy. We want change. We want to be participate. And we have seen women have been at the forefront of political change worldwide, such as in popular uprising in Sudan. If you're following the popular uprising that is going on in Sudan right now, women are forefront. They are the one really calling for change, and they don't afraid. They are very powerful in that. So I think I don't want to take much, but I wanted to end by saying global women movement are actively calling for democracy change and political change to pave the way for women's empowerment in different spheres, including economic, political, and social justice. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lilian. So we're gonna, I just wanted to let the participants know, that participants in the Zoom, the participants on YouTube as well. We just opened the Q&A so participants can actually submit their questions. So now I would like to turn to Lucina. Lucina, how does gender disinformation, and I want to make sure that you all know that the first time I heard this term, was from she persisted. How does gender disinformation contribute to the erosion of democratic institutions and the low level of participation of women in politics?
Thank you so much, Paulina. It's such a pleasure to be here with such an amazing cohort of friends, old friends, new friends, and allies. Thank you so much. And also so many of the things that Lilian talked about, in fact, resonate on the many challenges that women in politics report facing when even beginning to consider a political career or, in being effective in a political career. I will be talking about one specific aspect, as you mentioned, which is really gender disinformation and how it really affects women's ability to consider politics as an option for them, as well as then succeed once they are elected. This type of work started with me a couple of years ago as I did a research and interviews with more than 85 women leaders in 30 countries around the world around their relationship with traditional and particularly social media and how it changed the way that they are doing politics. And what I heard was very concerning. One of the women I interviewed, Julia Gillard, really talked about the double-edged sword that social media represented. On the one hand, it enabled women to reach their constituency, considering how difficult normally traditional media environments are and how close they are for women and women candidates. On the other hand, the amount of horrible content that they are targeted with on social media is really overwhelming. I heard from campaign organizers from the Hillary campaign, presidential campaign in the US, that in fact, the amount of energy that political teams have to spend just to defend a woman's reputation are absolutely overwhelming energy and resources, that when the women try to publicly shame the harassers, putting screenshots of the negative, threatening messages that they were receiving, platforms even threatened to sue them. And ultimately, what I have heard is that some women have said that they would never run for office again as a result of the attacks and the disinformation campaigns against them. And they are even discouraging other women, young women, to consider a political career. The truth is that we have known about this reality now for quite a while. Since 2016 came the first studies that reported how many women parliamentarians all over the world, and it was almost 50%, for sure it's more now, have seen humiliating, sexually charged images, most often fake images, doctored images of them circulating on social media, showing them nude. We know that 96% of existing deepfakes feature women in acts of non-consensual pornography. And from them to today, and finishing with a wonderful study that you, Paulina, and your group, Multitudes, did of women in politics in Chile, we have known that this is a reality. And increasingly also what we have heard is that digital platforms have known about this. They have known about the loopholes. They have known about the amount of attacks that women in politics are receiving and women are receiving, and yet they have failed to act. So when I think of gender disinformation, that is specifically really the disinformation that is targeting women politicians and has a gender nature in the type of narratives, I do see a number of different themes that are constantly coming up. An obsession with women's sexuality, whether they have children, don't have children, sexual orientation, themes around women lying, women in reality, having secret schemes, women being too stupid or too weak to hold office. Ultimately, the message that all those narratives want to give is actually very, very clear. And that's that women are not fit for politics, and that also politics is a dirty game. And therefore, anybody who is not willing to stay at this role, to be really defamed on social media on a daily basis, should not enter politics at all. Gender disinformation has also been used, as you have mentioned, actually, not only it has, often at the root of political violence against women in politics. Often it's used even to cover and justify the murder of political opponents, as it happened in Brazil to Marielle Franco. She was murdered in what really seems a politically motivated murder. And after her death, a number of disinformative narratives began circulating, trying to link her murder to issues of crime and to her own, presumed immorality, if you want, and therefore trying to sidetrack really what was the real motivation, which was really that Marielle Franco ultimately was asking for change and demanding change in Brazil. We see this happening all over the world. The presence of deepfakes has been also great in and gender disinformation in the last German elections for chancellor, with very, very terrible results, as we saw the only female candidate going from being the front runner, in fact, to becoming the third position within a few months, including as a result of such an overwhelming amount of attacks that she received, way more than her male competitors. So what we do see is that ultimately the finality of gender disinformation is even going beyond the individual women attacked. So this isn't only about, making sure that a certain individual woman doesn't get elected. It's really a way that's being used by authoritarian leaders, liberal actors, liberal movements, increasingly all over the world, again, from Brazil to Europe to the United States, to push back against the progress made on women's rights, minority rights. Women's rights have been defined the litmus test for human rights standard in a society. And therefore, when we attack women, most often is also with the finality of undermining human rights and eroding democratic institutions. And what we also know that, actually these type of attacks at times have also come from foreign countries as a way to influence foreign elections in a way that is beneficial for some countries' geopolitical interests. So there is a very strong political motivation. There is really most often a very strong coordination of sources that are very well resourced and connected to political power that don't want women to, get to office. They want to push them out of politics. They want to eliminate political opposition and backslide women's rights. Who are the actors behind this? We have talked about illiberal actors, authoritarian leaders, strongman political leaders that are all using, a framework and really an infrastructure that's already there through what we often call the manosphere, which is a conglomerate of websites, blogs, Facebook and other types of accounts that are propagating disinformation all kinds of horrible content against women's rights. And this is actually possible because the ways digital platforms are designed, in fact, is in order to amplify ultimately engagement, even when it means amplifying hate for profit. So we have known more and more, including from the latest reports of Facebook whistleblower Frances Hogan, that in fact there is a specific algorithm that has been studied to actually look at how much engagement you get, for example, by posting angry comments. And because angry comments are generating more engagement, they end up being amplified artificially. I don't want to leave you with the idea that, there is little to do or that there hasn't been movement. There definitely has been. We know that, that traditional media has an important role to play in not amplifying, for example, gender disinformation, and efforts have been made in that direction to train media so that they do not replicate narratives. In 2020, Representative Jackie Spear authored a letter to Facebook co-signed by 100 women, current and former parliamentarians from 30 countries, asking specifically to stop the amplification of gender disinformation and calling, really things by their name, and putting a focus on platforms, accountability and responsibility in this. And individual women have become more and more savvy in really changing the narrative and explain that truly social media campaigns against them really are meant at harming them politically, and that the way to respond is actually to denounce this type of behavior and to demand better. So that's the strategy that we are working on as She Persists, and that's what I think we need to do more of, and I would love to hear from everybody on this panel. I know that Paulina is working along some of the same lines. We definitely need more research to understand gender disinformation. We definitely need to support the women leaders in understanding how digital media works, not only to defend themselves, but to be able to push for change, both on terms of communication, changing the conversation in their countries, as well as for really changing digital platform standards and demanding for different standards and legal frameworks. And that's the other piece that we definitely need, because as for so many of the other elements, we won't be able to resolve these issues exclusively alone. We are most likely going to need, in fact, better public policy to respond. So thank you. Looking forward to the conversation with you all.
Thank you. And thank you to both panelists for being so good with time. I wanted to continue with Elisa. Elisa, I think that you heard a little bit from Lucina on our study, the first study of the Observatory, Women's Observatory Against Disinformation and Fake News. We surveyed all parliamentarians in Chile, and 97% of them, parliamentarian women in Chile, said that they were victims of disinformation and as a form of online violence. And you being a congresswoman, is disinformation a violation of women's rights to civic participation? And why is it important that these rights are actually protected?
Well, thank you all the panelists, and thank you Paulina and the Multitudes Foundation and Vital Voices and Tech Global Camp for allowing us to talk about this, because it's so important. And well, I think it's something that I like the most about this panel is that we are going to talk more or less about the same, with different points of view, because we are from different countries and we will live different situations. But I want to, first of all, send a big hug to all the fellow from BV Engage members of Vital Voices who are here, to my fellow MPs in Madrid who are connected right now, and all the girls from Libyan Women NGO who are following us today, because I wanted them to be part of this also. And I want to remember all the victims of gender-based violence around the world, because if we still have one victim, we have too much work to do. And we need to keep fighting on that. I want to start from data, because Spain, it's a good country in a point of view of equality, in a point of view of how many women we have in the parliaments. And according to the OECD data, we have equal access to rights and civil liberties. So in that point, we are perfect. And we have a 47.5% of female in first political positions in Spain. So we are facing a situation who is very well for and fine for the women's situation, because we have mostly a half of the women in politics. Now, the quota is important. Lilian talked about it. The quota is important because we need to educate people in that we have a paper and we are the 50% of the population. And I want to start because here in Spain, we have three things that I think they are so important. We have the Pact Against Gender Violence that was approved by the majority parties of our country. We have two organic laws, that one is for the effective equality of women and men. And then we have the comprehensive protection measures against gender violence. And this is important because we need to have a legal structure to develop all the rights, to develop all the efforts in a proper way. That's so important. And we need to work on that. And I offer myself in any country, and anyone needs help about studying these laws or anything, I'm so glad if I can help in anything. And right now we are the 11th country. Well, this data is from 2019, and we were the 11th in the OECD's social institutions and gender index, more or less, okay? So we are okay, we're all right, we're doing very well, and we have no problem, you might say, but we're facing a problem that it's so big, and I think it's a very serious problem, and it's something we're facing all the European countries. And there is a survey from a month ago that shows that 20% of young people in Spain deny violence against women and deny discrimination based on sex. 20%. That's a lot of, because it's not a 7%, it's a 20% of young people who thinks that. So we have a problem because we have that regulatory framework that protects us. We have that full legal equality. The real equality is on the way, but we are offering something that is wrong for the young people who reject reality head on. And I will talk about young people because they are the present and the future, and I think it's so important to talk about them. Are we educating well, or are we suffering from total disinformation? Are we anesthetized to many social networks? Is the real information in the networks? There's something about the fake news and everything who is just jumping in our brains through the socials, through TikToks, through Instagram, through everywhere, every platform we use. But is this disinformation and this inattention that is leading us to an error as society? Because education is the key of our society. With a good education, with a good knowledge, we develop critical and analytical societies. And we live at a time when only extremes seems to exist. Polarization is in the order of the day, and we live at such a speed that we do not realize what is happening around us. Why do we fail when we have everything? And I'm talking about the European countries. Why do we fail? Because we are failing on the education of future generations. We have countries that change their educational laws depending on the political party in power. So we have 4 years of one law education, and then the next 4 years we have a completely different law education. We currently, and I will talk about the Spain situation, have a Minister of Equality who has dedicated herself to attacking men in her statements and to destruction of the gender, and therefore the feminist cause. And all the feminists from Spain, they are screaming because they cannot understand how a minister who is working for the equality is going against the feminist movement. That's not fair. Remember the data that I gave you, that we were on the 11th position, more or less. In its last 2019-2020 report, the Women, Peace and Security Index, prepared by the Georgetown University and the University of Oslo, right now Spain is facing the 5th place, 10 places below the previous edition of 2017-2018, in which the country ranked 5th, as mentioned in the cited article. That's terrible, because we are not getting better, we are going back. So we are living a catastrophe at the feminist level. All the feminists are saying that here in our country. And about the question, We have some challenges about this disinformation. First of all, we must educate men and women in equality from a young age. We need to start that from the babysitter till they are, I don't care what age, but we need to start since they are babies, since they are in the kindergarten. That's so important. Secondly, we cannot corner 50% of society. We have to explain and we have to educate that we deserve the same respect, rights, and opportunities. And I want to ask, so then they can answer, how many of you watch TV on a daily basis? And how many of you watch HBO, Netflix, whatever platform? So young people are consuming less and less television, and they are consuming more platforms and social networks like TikTok or Instagram, living an unreal world and where viral challenges are presented in many occasions are the opposite to equality. In this life of showcase, of appearance, of photo, we have to get hooked and reach, and we are not reaching the people. We are not reaching the youth generations. We need to explain well that we can and must live together in harmony and improve the situation of women's rights around the world. I remember you, the 20% of young people who don't believe that this is happening. So we need to get them that information. We need to give them in a proper way. We need to offer that information in a prettiest way, let's say, like honey, because in that way they will take them. But if not, they are going to go against that. And that's a problem we're facing in the European countries. As Lucina said about the insults people face as women, I want to put an example that was terrible. Here in Madrid, we have a president who is a woman here in Madrid, and she was insulted during the whole pandemic because of its decisions, insulted even by the president of Spain. Terrible. All the people, men, were insulting a president who was just trying to find not the cure, but just a proper way to get over this pandemic we all suffered. And she was insulted, and she was said that she was crazy and that she was mad and that she was dumb, everything. And all women have to unite the countries and the different parties to fight for this cause. This is not a party cause. This is a global cause. This is a cause of everyone, of the 100% of the society, men and women included, both. It's so important. We need to get to that. Because if not, we still have the same problem. And it is fine in our country that we arrived at one point that maybe 0.5% of the population, it's, well, the 0.5% of the women are in politics. But it's also true that we need to help the countries that haven't arrived and achieved that situation to achieve also. We cannot close our countries, we cannot close our policies. This should be global policies. This should be something bigger that makes like a tsunami of the equality arriving each point of the earth. That's so important. And I want to end and to finish this because right now my party is not in the national government, and we are all concerned about these problems. But this shouldn't be a party cause. Really, we need to have state pacts from all the parties, because we are not talking about how do you think or how do I think and how do we feel the economy should rule the world. We are all talking about that we need to have the same opportunities, and we need to change the world who is around us, and we need to make it nicer, and we need to make it more less competitive. Competitive in a way that it should be something cooler, and not thinking only about the trendings, not thinking only about the TikToks, the Instagrams, the viral challenges. We need to go far away from that. We need to youth people get involved in this, because we are not giving them the right information to them change the world after us. They think that they are part of the problem, but they are part of the solution. And we need to change the speech. We need to make it less violent, so the youth generation can change really and can achieve that we want, and that we really want for all the world, that it's the equality in all the sides of the world. And I want to finish saying thank you, and also offering myself again. And if anyone needs, don't hesitate in contact me for project, for development about new legislation, if you want to compare with the Spanish legislation, because legislation helps, but it's not the only. We need the education to be the base of everything. If we don't have a good education, we won't have good citizens, and we won't have good laws. So that will be my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you so much, especially for speaking so honestly and in such an intimate way. So I really appreciate it. We do have 2 more speakers. We're definitely going to be 15 past the hour. I apologize to the panelists particularly, but just don't want to cut anybody off. So Tasreen, I would like to ask you, in your experience and from your point of view and perspective, why is it important to fund women empowerment programs, especially focusing on the Global South?
Absolutely. Well, I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Being at Vital Voices, seeing you all on the screen, hearing you all about the impact that our programs and our networks are making just, warms my heart. It's what helps me get out of bed every day. So I appreciate that. And also for allowing me to share my perspective on this. I think in order to really answer your question, to me, the answer is simple. I think funding these types of programs it's probably the most effective, easiest, and critically important way to ensure democracies are working and that they're sustained, because ultimately what you're funding are opportunities to ensure women's voices are being heard within the democratic system. When you think of everything that needs to happen for democracies to truly sustain and thrive, you have to ensure that you are creating an enabling environment for all people to take part of the process. But then you also have to work with those communities who have a voice. They're not struggling to have a voice, they have a voice, but they may not be getting heard, or they may not have the access and the means to ensure that their voices are getting heard. This is important because we know that women are the ones that know their communities. They know their needs, they know the nuances, the grievances, everything about their communities, where they come from, and represent, their communities, their people, and are also looking to find ways to address those. On top of that, when it comes to women's participation in electoral political processes, one of the biggest barriers are the societal norms and expectations put on them. And in many communities, when women are told that their vote doesn't matter, they shouldn't run for office, their issues aren't important, or they're being faced with incredible, like the examples that we talked through today, cases of disinformation, violence against women in the electoral process, it's really hard to come away from that and seek to engage in the process when there's so many barriers in the way, so many people, so many institutions, so many societal factors that are telling you to back off. And so these are the types of programs, women's empowerment programs in particular, that are incredibly needed because they create awareness about the role and the value that women play in democratic systems and in democratic governance. They inform women about their political rights. They empower them to meaningfully take part in their country's governance. And they create awareness, the awareness that Elisa was talking about that's needed in all forms of the democratic process. And so that's, just speaking from a very big picture, that's why it's so important. One of the things that we also know really well at Vital Voices is that women are the ones who know their communities, like I mentioned before. They have the solutions to the problem that their communities are experiencing. So when it comes to funding women's empowerment programs, especially in the Global South, it's just as important to fund programs designed and led by women or run by women's civil society groups led within those communities. You know, women's organizations, women-led civil society, labor unions, organizations for women in media and journalism, you know, you can think of every single aspect of the democratic process. They're critically important to fund because they have the reach, they know the priorities, and they also know the messages that need to be sent when it comes to accessing the political system and creating the changes within those systems. You know, how someone decides to fund, whether the donor is a government, is an organization, a multilateral institution, a company, whoever, you know, how they choose to spend their funds and how they create their budgets are really where the rubber hits the road. And, you know, I've said this, so many activists have said this across the gambit that, you know, your budgets really show your priorities. Budgets are a moral document. They show where your priorities are, what you value, and how you choose to spend your funding. And so when you're thinking about it from that perspective, you know, if you really do want to create some change and you really do want to support democratic systems, institutions, change democratic norms, and really create a system that is thriving and resilient, you have to earmark those funds and especially target women-led groups to really, really do that work because they know what the needs are, they know how to do it. They just need a little bit of support from you to really take it to that next level. And so also thinking about how funding is determined, how people decide to spend their funds, there are also a couple of key factors that I think are just as important. The first one is you know, meeting women where they are, meeting women leaders where they are, and knowing that not everything has to be completely perfect in a proposal, for example, before choosing to fund them. I think at Vital Voices, that's one of the key values that we bring is we meet women leaders where they are in their leadership journeys. And because they know what the needs are of their communities, and you've heard me say this 10 times already in the last 2 minutes, they just need that opportunity and that chance and that funding that can be very transformative. So how you're reaching out to groups, who you're reaching out to is just as important, and how you're supporting them in their own development, in their own leadership in order to do this work is just as important. I think it's also important to ensure that donors are reaching out to diverse communities and diverse women and ensuring that women's groups are being funded. I think some of the trends that I've seen over the course of my career is a lot of donors and a lot of funders go to some of the same groups and they're well established. Again, they know what they're doing, but that also means someone is being left behind. So how are you looking at other communities? What about groups that work on the political participation and rights of women with disabilities, Indigenous communities? You know, these are communities that are just as much value add to this conversation, but have far harder ways to go when it comes to accessing these levels of funding. And then I would also say ensuring the mechanisms used for funding match the capacity of the people in the orgs that are being funded. You know, I know donors and other funders have to balance this need to ensure that there are checks and balances and money is being spent ethically, but there also needs to be some flexibility built in so that when it comes to implementing programs and designing programs, it's reflective of the current context and the challenges in which organizations are operating. You know, we said it earlier, women's groups are the ones on the ground that are doing this work on a day-to-day basis. The contexts are continuously changing. I mean, the biggest example is the pandemic. Everything, we had to shift the way that we operated because of that. And I'm hoping that a lot of the flexibility that we were able to see from donors and funders when it comes to supporting these types of programs really do last because it's needed. And you know, democracies can be very fragile. And so being able to meet the needs in the current context in a way where the flexibility is actually the norm and not something you have to apologize for is very much important. And I would also say, you know, programs need to be funded that support and empower women at all points of the political process and democratic governance. So, you know, funding programs to ensure that there is an increase in women elected leaders is so incredibly important. At the same time, I want to make sure people don't forget that you also need to support and fund programs that help women with their voter registration, that help women in communities create awareness about their electoral rights overall, create awareness about what it is that they need in order to actively take part in these different parts of the democratic process. So those are just my perspectives and my points of view. I try to keep it short because I know we're running low on time, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tasreen. Thank you so much. I mean, we often, when we connected with Lucina, we always discuss what is the issue with funders not actually funding research with focusing on a strong data, particularly in the global south. And that's a big question, I think, that I always ask to my funders when I meet with them. So there are some questions in the Q&A. I want you to feel free to go and answer them. They're not specific. Actually, Batilde answer one of them. Thank you. I mean, that was a very nice way to answer. And I was thinking about a different type of answer. So thank you for taking that one away from me. So now, particularly with you, Batilde, and thank you so much for being here. Tremendous experience and background as well. What are you thinking, or what do you think are the potential strategies to increase women's representation in politics despite the obstacles they face? And how do these approaches intersect with the media?
Excellent. Well, first of all, also, I want to thank you, all the organizers, for the invitation to join the discussion today. And to my fellow panelists, it's been great to listen to your unique perspectives and expertise on the issues that we're covering. And is this big goal of ensuring that we have a complete democracy, because a democracy without women is incomplete. It's what drives this conversation today, but I believe it's also what drives our everyday work in each of the areas and realms of work that we are represented here. I always talk about, I use the analogy of the glass half full when it comes to progress regarding women in politics in the Americas, and I'm going to talk from my own region. In other words, we cannot deny there have been important achievements so far. Nobody questions the women's right to vote. We see leaders demonstrating that being a woman and being a leader are not incompatible. We've moved in Latin America, we've made interesting progress regarding affirmative action measures that ensure women are included in the list offered to the electorate in terms of quotas, but also in terms of parities, with I believe 8 countries that have adopted parity laws in their own countries. However, there's still much to be done, and I mean, your presentation, Paulina, at the beginning really illustrated where are the gaps in terms of representation, and I believe all of the panelists, including the first one, was very clear in showing how important that representation is in terms of ensuring results that hopefully are favorable to not just one sector of the population, but to everyone. In terms of the obstacles, and let's see, obstacles and strategies, and I'll try to be as quickly as possible because I know that we're kind of running out of time. In terms of the obstacles, I believe we should start with the premise that women who run for office, women who have a public participation, face questions and obstacles almost unthinkable for male candidates and for fellow male politicians. No, they have a harder time securing campaign funds. They deal with misogynistic stereotypes, including from their own colleagues within parties. And in a way, these become practical obstacles for them exercising or projecting themselves in terms of a public life, right? One of the first barriers I would mention that women confront is the perception or the public perception of female leadership, right? And whether a woman can actually get elected. Data from Latin America shows that fewer than 1 out of 3 citizens say they strongly reject the idea that men make better politicians than women. And I believe it should be 3 out of 3 if you ask me. So female politicians face some resistance or more resistance than men and prejudices regarding the exercise of their own political leadership. So that's why it's so important, as the previous panelists showed, investing in programs to change this conversation, right, in social and public life. A second great point of resistance to women in politics often comes from their own parties. This is something that it's very important when it comes to how women are positioned in party lists that are offered to voters, right? Because placement in party lists is a determinant factor in electoral success. And what we see is that women, at least for the research we have from the Inter-American Development Bank on political parties, we see that women are around 50% of the militancy or the members of political parties. However, this does not translate in them having 50% representation in the list that are offered in elections. The point on financing, we talk about techos de billetes, money ceilings. Women face more ceilings in terms of accessing funds for their campaigns than men. We recently did a survey along with a couple of colleagues that, we tend to be researching and trying to understand these questions. We did this survey through the Latin American Political Reform Project at the Autonomous University in Mexico that showed that almost 50% of both male and female politicians acknowledge, recognize there is a gender gap in the distribution of campaign funding within parties. And then this is just within parties. If we go to countries, for instance, that allow the private financing of political campaigns, what we see is that women have less possibility of using personal funds, have to rely on donations by families, and often cannot access the networks, las redes, the networks of private financiers of political parties or candidacies, let's say. And finally, and then to touch on the issue of the media, I believe that unequal and sexist media coverage reinforces these perceptions and really practically becomes an obstacle to women's democratic representation. There's data from the Global Media Monitoring Project that by the year of 2015, which is the latest that I was able to get, that shows that out of 22,000 articles analyzed, women were covered as news subjects in only 24% of those, right? And in the particular case of Latin America, because this is the one, the portion of the report that I was really interested into, they confirmed that women are generally represented in mainly traditional roles, social and health issues, the family relationships were subject of the coverage, how, who was their male referent in the family, and, all these things that in a way tend to position women in a less, in a disadvantaged position in terms of running for politics or for public office. So in the face of these obstacles, a couple of strategies, some strategies that we could think or we could consider to help increase the representation in democratic life. Number one, the issue of public directed or targeted public financing is something that may level the playing field for women to compete in elections. And we have in Latin America countries such as Panama, Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, Brazil, Honduras that have allocated funds for women's leadership training. This is an example, but we have others, like in the case of Brazil, where public funding is used to indirectly finance women's campaigns by providing them free access or airtime in TV, radio, and other media for them to show, to share their message, share the proposals that they have. And we have the cases of Chile and Costa Rica where parties are giving extra funding if they manage to get women elected. A second strategy that I believe we will start seeing much more in Latin America and maybe in Africa and other regions of the world is crowdfunding, or let's just say online fundraising for women candidacies, which has emerged lately as an alternative to targeted public financing for female candidates. And we see, for instance, in the case of the 2018 Mexican elections, a group of leaders from government, academia, civil society launched a fund to specifically cover legal and administrative fees for women candidates who have been victims of gender political violence, right? The US has Emily's List, which kind of covers or helps fund campaigns by women of certain political positions. And I think, we're going to start to see this more at the very individual level, no? Citizens who want to really see women running for office. And let me close on the issue of the role of the media. Of course, some countries have successfully targeted gender bias in the media, but here I believe training programs can help journalists become aware of their prejudices, and this is something that we really need to work on. I won't touch on the issue of online violence and online, access to online social media, because I think it's been covered very nicely by the previous panelists, but I will just mention an interesting exercise in Mexico in 2017 where the National Electoral Management Body, the National Electoral Institute, that's the name, ELINE, along with other civil society organizations, train journalists in terms of realizing their own gender bias, and really giving them concrete tips such as avoiding personal questions when it comes to female candidacies, avoid basing their questions on stereotypes or double standards, right? So that there could be a more equal coverage of male and female candidacies. I had a bit on online violence and the ways and manifestations of gender violence online, but I believe that has been very well covered by my colleagues. So I will leave it here for now and remain available to any questions and comments that may come. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you, Batilde. And again, there are some questions being asked, and I think some of you have started to answer. It's 5:09. We're going to take 10 more minutes. I think, again, we thank you to the audience that's still with us and to you for the extra time. But so there is one thing that kind of repeated itself with Lilian and then also with Batilde, which is the issue of quotas and representation and in electoral processes. I mean, and we know quota doesn't work because quota is towards the number of candidates to an elected position, but then the system doesn't correct itself. I mean, the only experience that I've had, I'm sure there are others, is with the conventional constitution in Chile, where the organ needed to have parity. So there were multiple numbers of candidates, and then the system itself corrected when they had one candidate over another one, female versus male. However, and unfortunately, kind of the system worked against us because there were more women elected than male, but the system corrected itself to end up in parity. So it's that's very interesting because it really speaks of a multidimensional problem when it comes to women participation in democratic processes. It is funding, it is changes in legislation and bills, making sure that political parties are also involved. We know that when it comes to political parties, in the case of disinformation, in some cases, they are the members of the political parties creating this type of campaigns against their own party members in order to deteriorate and delegitimize their participation. So there are some questions there we've been asking in terms of what are the entrepreneurial or business opportunities for women to address the issue of gender disinformation? Are there opportunities for a collaboration across civil society? That would be a great question for Tasring to answer. There was another question regarding impediments in hindering women for not participating in political leadership. And how is this a cultural impediment? Because the community in the North where I work is facing this challenge. So my question is, how can this issue be addressed? Thanks, Shirene from Nigeria. And there are other questions that are actually being answered. So you can do it. And then there is a final question, because I think I'm going to leave those three questions there. The second question, maybe Lilian, you can take it. And the third question is from someone anonymous. It says in Spanish, some governments name women in elected positions related to taking care of one. For example, the Minister of Women, the Minister of Family, and they say that is a more equilibrium and balanced presence to men and women. Which is the best strategy to demonstrate that equal representation of women must be improved not only in quantity but also in quality? So those are some of the questions that we have. I would like to start with Tasreen, if you want to answer the first question regarding entrepreneurial or business opportunity for women to address the issue of gender disinformation. Are there opportunities for collaboration across civil society?
Sure, I'm happy to tackle it, but I feel like Lucina might also have some great insights here.
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Short answer is yes. I think there's definitely an opportunity for collaboration across civil society and with businesses, because I think the issue itself is cross-cutting across sector and industry, right? It's impacting women political leaders or women civic leaders that are, very much public facing in their jobs, but it's also something that governments need to start address. And it's also something that companies like social media platforms also need to start addressing. So I do think there is opportunity for collaboration, but finding the funding in order to actually do that can be challenging. I don't know, Lucina, if there's any other nuance that you want to add to this response here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually think that, what you're pointing out there is very important. Absolutely. We have seen that when women's organizations get together over a unified message and are able to really pass that message across, they are much more successful in having an impact to the broader society. So collaboration is essential. Collaboration takes time. And as you mentioned, I think it's really important to look at the resources and how resources are allocated to ensure that women's organizations aren't depleted and don't have to take one more ask without necessarily having the opportunity of doing that. I think that action and advocacy that's also grounded on research is very, very valuable. And so the possibility of really get more information on what are the narratives that are most harmful to women candidates, for example, so that, responses can be grounded on that research is actually very variable and hardly ever happens, unfortunately, because again, the funds are generally not there. And here I'm also talking about the siloing that I had seen in one of the questions from the audience coming in also between, the democracy space and the women's rights space. That really doesn't make any sense because, as many pointed, with women being 50% of the population, anything that has to do with women very much has to do with democracy. I also want to very quickly, give a brief response to the question around social norms. I think that what's happening online and gender disinformation in particular are really crucial to think about and take into account when we think around social norms around women and women's political participation. Because we know that what young people and people in general see on social media changes the way they behave. Often people do say and write things that they would not have felt allowed to say and write. And those things are then artificially amplified and become a new social norm so that it's now okay. And the envelope has been pushed in a negative way and has gone again, maybe what we managed to achieve through 20 years of feminist activism. So in this respect, I think that, we need to look at improving social media because that's a place where new social norms and often harmful social norms get created and get created against women's political participation, often through fake stories that are really meant at showing supposedly that women are not fit for office. And then that becomes a reality that's believed by many people, even if it's untrue. So I think we really need, when we think of like social norms that are representative barriers, pay attention that social norms in fact might be worsening as a result of gender disinformation against women in politics. And also we do see an element of self-censorship there that's actually very, very concerning, because we know that women of all types, women politicians, women journalists, but also, young women in general self-censoring as a result of the gender disinformation and hate that they see happening online. And this again reinforces the fact that the voices that we see online are mostly misogynist voices that then get artificially amplified because of algorithms that, strengthen hate because it generates more engagement. And so you get really a vicious cycle there. And that's where I think we are now. And that's the place that we need to get out of through better digital platform standards, stronger investment in women's rights organizations that are really carrying this work forward.
Thank you, Lucina. And I think that you started sort of answer the issue of the social norm. And Lilian, I wanted to ask you if you can also let us know your views regarding the question that we received saying, good evening, the impediments in hindering women from not participating in political leadership is a cultural impediment because the community where I live is facing this challenge. So my question is, how can this issue be addressed?
Well, I think there are so many ways people could view this or could reach into a solution, but I like the statement that's said by one of the panelists that a cup half full, and that's what we have now. It's the quota system might not be necessarily effective as we all want it to include more women, but this is what we have, because if we don't have it, then we have nothing. So it's better we have half cup, half full. But the quota system itself that brings more women into power, there are different types. So the quota that is produced by the party, which is called the party list, they will have the list of the female they want, or the legal system of that specific country that would say, for example, the electoral policies or laws that requires the candidate to be the percentage, a certain number of women have to be there. Or sometimes in like the case in South Sudan, we have something called a women list. I think the main problem here is that the appointment, there is a different, there are countries who go through elections, and through the processes, women still face challenges within the election processes. But the appointment, I mean, there are some countries, they just appoint women, whoever they feel that women is the best, not necessarily that they go through the election process. So I don't have necessarily definite answer on how to go about this, because it depends on the context. So each context has a different way of dealing with that. But I think it's if we continue the way we're doing now in terms of collaboration, in terms of raising our voice and making our presence, and conduct ourselves in a way that we can be trusted. Like we know most of us mentioned that women are not being taken serious, and that's the problem, because they have a different perception about how the woman is supposed to be. Like in my country, a woman's place is supposed to be in the kitchen, period. So if you try to be out of the norm or out of the role they assign to you, that might be a problem. So I'll just stop here and allow somebody else to come in.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Kind of heartbreaking statement instead of the place of a woman in the kitchen. And I remember so many stupid jokes from when growing up regarding the women in the kitchen. So I have one more question, final question, and it's for Batilde. And it says, what is the best strategy to demonstrate that equity representation of women must be improved not only in quantity, but also in quality?
Excellent. Well, I think we've already, all of us, alluded to some strategies that could be used in that regard. I was also thinking about the cultural impediment question that was also put in the chat. And of course, this ultimately has to do with values and stereotypes and how much we believe as a society in equity and equality, both things in terms of women and men. And these deficits in people's perception about women's role and really the goal of equality requires multiple strategies, or let's just say in different levels. Just to give some examples, I believe one of the key strategies has to be from the social public sector, relating to policies that better distribute the care of the private between not just men and women, but between the family, la empresa, the private sector, as well as the public sector, Costa Rica, Uruguay have implemented interesting policies on this, that ultimately time that women spend taking care of the private because of these expectations in society is time they cannot invest in public life, in resolving community problems, in projecting themselves publicly. So that's definitely a strategy or a policy that needs to be pursued. Another one is all of us in every space that we are work towards the symbolic recognition of female leaders that are doing it very nice, that are doing it well. This symbolic recognition on the part of the state is more valuable, but all of us doing it helps in change perceptions and naturalize women's presence in leadership positions. I also think that we need to, and this is kind of incipient in Latin America, but some things are being done on the issue of new masculinities, understanding masculinity not based on the stereotypes that we are all raised with, but in co-parenting, on same right that a man has to exert public leadership is the same right that a woman has, and not making women pay more costs because of that. Right? It's not the cost that ultimately can even be their own lives, as you were reporting at the beginning of the seminar. It also kind of relates to our own leadership as women. And Tazreen was I really like how she said our own, I believe you said leadership trajectory or something like that. We all have our own, nosotros cada una tenemos nuestro camino. I'm sorry, it just comes better in Spanish, but investing in that leadership and ensuring that we are preparing ourselves and learning.
We all have our own roads, right?
Exactly, our own road, and strengthen our own leadership so that we can be more assertive in demanding the space, not in the family ministry necessarily, even though we definitely will do great there, but in the energy commission or in the, economic ministry. Because we are as capable as men to do that, but we also have to strengthen our leadership, find also, amplify each other's voices, create nice alliances so that when the moment comes for us to grab that opportunity, we have people advocating for ourselves and supporting that. I mean, it's in so many different levels, but I just gave you some examples of my own experience.
No, but they're definitely actually fantastic examples, and thank you so much to all of you. As you know, in the margins of the Summit for Democracies, governments are invited to submit commitments that need to put into action during this year of action that the organizers of this summit are calling it, to the time that they will have to actually implement that. And the idea that we have within the organization, and as a member of the steering committee of the human rights at this Summit for Our Democracy, we do have the idea of governments that want to implement commitments related to ending online gender violence in all shape or forms, especially from our perspective, when it's about online gender violence, and that hinders women's participation in electoral processes. So we will be reaching out to many of you regarding this issue. And I would like to thank Lilian, Lucina, Elisa, Tisreen, and Batilde for joining us today, Vital Voices and TechCamp Global for their partnership, and all the audience here for taking the time to participate in this panel. It stayed in a lot longer than the panel originally was supposed to last. To fight disinformation as a threat to democracy, there are governance, private sector, and research-based solutions. However, my personally favorite is that our best chance to combat disinformation, especially when it's targeting women participating in decision-making processes, is research. And we don't have a lot of research. We need to document and analyze gender disinformation so we can respond more effectively through policy making. While we keep collecting data, we encourage government, civil society organizations, and citizens to follow some recommendations. For example, pursue long-term solutions to fight disinformation, focusing on education, as many of the panelists mentioned, and due diligence. This is so important, so citizens can identify it and combat this type of gender violence. And both media and social media companies must work on preventing, publishing, and spreading disinformation campaigns. We know that they are not the only ones at fault, but they need to start changing their approach. It has to be more strategic than reactive. And also, disinformation against women must be introduced as a serious threat to democracy, to set this issue on the public agenda and as a public problem, and pursue, hopefully, a system change. What's at stake for democracy with disinformation against women is too important to ignore. We must take action for us women and democracy as a whole. So I wanted to thank you, ladies, for being here with me today. It's been a pleasure and an honor. And we thank you, everyone who was here with us today. And we hope that you continue watching all the different panels that civil society has put together in the margins of the Summit for Democracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.